many of you have been a Christian, have been born again for 50 years of your life? Raise your hand. 50 years. You've known Jesus for 50 years at least. How many? 40 years. At least 40 years. Okay, put your hand down. How many of you have known Jesus for 30 years?
I'll go there.
30 years or more. 20 years? 20 years? 10 years. You've known Jesus for at least 10 years. How many of you, put your hands down, have known Jesus less than 10 years? Okay. As you look at that, all different things at times in which we've walked with the Lord, but how well do we know Him? Even today. What if you lived and ate and walked with Jesus for 3 straight years on this earth? You think you knew Him fairly well. Yet, Philip said this to Jesus in John 14. Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip, even after I have been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? And when the time came for Jesus to die on that cruel cross, to lay down His life, here are these disciples who had walked with Him 3 years, day in and day out. They were stunned, even though Jesus tried to tell them. But it was more than that they were stunned. They just refused to accept it. They would have none of it. It says in Matthew 16, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that He must be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised to life. Peter took Him aside and began to rebuke Him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Wow. A sharp rebuke to this one who had been with Him, who had laid down his nets, left his occupation, left his home to follow Christ. It says on the night that Jesus was arrested in the garden, the Gospel of Matthew tells us that all of the disciples deserted Him and fled. None appeared at the scene of the crucifixion except Mary, the mother of Jesus, the other women of the inner circle, and the Apostle John. The ones He had walked with day in and day out. They were crushed. Their world was shattered. Their hopes dashed, and they did not know what to think. Their sense of loss and despair was shared by the broader discipleship, the broader group that followed Jesus. But this morning, I don't want to look at all of them, but I want to look at one particular individual among that group, a woman named Mary Magdalene. A woman, we had testimonies right after communion of how Jesus had transformed lives. What I wanted to say prior to that is that you and I are proofs of the resurrection today. We are living and walking proof of what God has done through His power. So I want to look at one such woman whose life was transformed and look at her as she begins to move through the sequence of events of the betrayal, Christ's crucifixion and death, and then later His resurrection. And I chose Mary because Mary Magdalene stands as a prominent figure in the crucifixion and resurrection accounts of not just one, but all 4 Gospels. She is named among those at the foot of the cross in Matthew, Mark, and John. She, with the other women, were the first to discover the empty tomb. And according to John's Gospel, she was the very first person to see the resurrected Lord. And what do we know of this woman? We don't know that much, but we know she was a sinner, and she held no special place of honor. Yet she was the very first person to see the resurrected Christ. It was not one of the 12, it was not Jesus' own mother, but this woman, this formerly sinful woman, named Mary, from a village called Magdala. I want you to pull out your sermon notes. In your bulletins, you'll find the text that we're going to be reading there. If you don't have that, raise your hand and the ushers are going to help you. And our text reading today is from John chapter 20, verses 1 to 18. 1 to 18. Starting in verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon and Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple, this is John, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that this Jesus had to rise from the dead. And then the disciples went back to their homes. Can you imagine Peter and John? They're like, they believe it, they see it, but they don't quite believe it. They believe it, but they're not sure what they're believing in. I can just imagine that's their sense. So they go back to their homes pondering all this that they had just witnessed. But Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken away my Lord," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not recognize it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." He called her name. She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I am not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. As you look at this first resurrection account, this first resurrection appearance, and you think about this woman named Mary called Mary Magdalene. What do we know about her? Very little. Aside from the narratives of the crucifixion and resurrection accounts, she's only mentioned in Luke 8:2, and there we're told she was a sinful woman who Jesus had delivered from 7 demons. Yet if we were to walk with her, trace her actions from the death of Christ to the discovery of the empty tomb, and then his resurrection appearance, to follow her is to follow the heart of a true disciple, a true heart of devotion. Look at her steps. She stood at the foot of the cross upon which Jesus suffered, and she witnessed his death. She followed as Joseph of Arimathea carried the body of Jesus to the tomb for burial, his own tomb, and observed where they laid him. She, with the others, went back and rested for the Sabbath, but that Sabbath was anything but restful. Could not wait until the first break of day, the end of the Sabbath, where she could move. And at first light, she followed.